Welcome to Production Value Matters, the business event podcast, brought to you by Byrne Production Services. Here, we explore the different ways business events can bring value to your organization, the latest technological advances in the event space, as well as providing you with actionable strategies to make a business event a success. Let's create an exceptional event experience.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to a special episode of Production Value Matters, the business events podcast. This is the first in a series of episodes we'll be doing to help guide event professionals and marketing professionals on the ins and outs of event production and audiovisual production for meetings, conferences, trade shows, etc. And joining me on this series is a good, close, personal friend of mine, Mr. Michael Hooper, one of the great independent professional project managers that I have been privileged to know as a professional colleague and friend for, I think it's been close to 15 years, Michael. So yeah, we both had hair at the beginning of our friendship. So welcome, Michael. Why don't you tell everybody a little bit about yourself and what you're doing these days?
Hey, yeah, so I'm an independent technical producer. I've been in the industry for around 20-ish years, let's say. Started as a theater kid, building sets and sort of doing all the things. And eventually, because I liked paying my mortgage and buying groceries and stuff, moved over to corporate AV, I think, I want to say 2005. And ever since, just sort of been bopping around in this world and trying to do as many cool things as humanly possible and with some cool people.
All right. So again, welcome, Michael. This is again a set of episodes that we'll be doing over the next little while where we're going to be handling different subjects on per diems, contracts, the nitty and gritty of audiovisual production, and not necessarily like, hey, this is a cool new product that you should try out, but more about helping planners and organizers understand the back end. And so today's subject is the difference between an audiovisual rental company and a production company. Pretty much like, what's that difference? Give a good pro and con of both, and then when a planner or a producer should use one or the other. And so this will be a pretty informal conversation, and we'll just sort of jump into it. But so how do you define the difference between an AV rental company and a production company?
Yeah, I think that's actually a great place to start. And we get into this, and there's like a lot of crossover, and there are many AV companies that sort of position themselves as production companies. And so I think clarifying is actually great. I think an AV company is where you go to rent some stuff. It's like the Blockbuster of technology. You need a fogger, you need some sticks of truss, you need some motors. You go to an AV company to rent it. And that's sort of what their value prop is that they will give you stuff. And you can just go and get piecemeal whatever you want. I think a production company gets way more involved in the planning process, and you want to bring them in way earlier. And they sort of do a bit more of the actual heavy lifting of helping you design your concept, design your execution. I don't want to say design your strategy, although I think there are some production companies out there that do that really well. But by and large, they largely focus on the technical execution and how to best help you get there, as opposed to just backing a truckload of gear up to a venue and.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you're absolutely right that there's like, I always describe it as sort of a Venn diagram, right? There's a lot of things that an AV company will do that sort of Venn diagram into what a production company does. And there was certainly a trend as a value add for AV rental companies over, a 5 to 10 year period. Certainly when we met first, where they were offering production services as a value add to try and get their rental inventory off of their shelves, right? And I think that also came from the market itself, right? The market would sort of demand that and try to find some economic efficiencies. And, well, look, if I'm getting all the bits and pieces from these guys, they seem very creative and they know they get me as a client and a customer, so maybe they can do some of that as well. But I think the flip side of that is that it's muddied that Venn diagram so that in the market, there's the perception that they're actually just one big circle. This is a debate I have all the time with our business model. And certainly we're trying to service our customers, that sometimes we get people calling us saying, hey, I'd like to rent some equipment. And we're like, well, we don't have anything to rent to you because that's not what we do. And sort of clarifying that message to clients. Have you ever had, because you and I both worked for AV rental companies and like run and been part of other production companies, on the AV rental side, did you ever have that sort of conversation with potential clients who were thinking, oh, you're an AV rental company. Great. Can you also be my production company? And how did you communicate?
Yeah, you sort of hit it. There was a period of time, I want to say maybe around the time we met 15-ish years ago, when every middling sized AV company that I knew of anyway in Toronto started doing drawings. And that, I think, was sort of the tipping point, because a planner would come to a technician, a technologist, a technology company, and ask them to help them with the technical drawings, which makes perfect sense. They know the gear, they know how it goes together. But that led into many of these folks starting to be considered designers, which I think is where we got down this weird slope of blurring the distinction between someone who's going to rent you equipment and someone you can depend on to help you sort of design your entire show. And around that time, I was working for our friends at PRG, and had moved and was about to move from there to Westbury, which, for those of you who don't know, was a sort of a middling-ish, is a large-ish company in Toronto, but let's say smallish out in the world. And they were moving from, they were making that transition sort of from being the gear rental house to wanting to take on a bit more and help more with the overall event, which was a long transition. But there were periods of time where, like, and I struggle to say this because I know that some of my friends will be listening to this, where we took on more than we really should have. There wasn't, at that time, we weren't in a place to really be advising on overall event design. Technical drawings, technical designs, absolutely. Tell us where, the audience wants to come in, tell us how their flow is going to go, and we'll help you put together the truss structure and the drapery and the lighting and do the audio plots. But we were being asked to maybe consult on more than was really our purview at the time. Towards, say, later into the late 2010s, so around 2017, 2018, 2019, we got way better at that, because at that point we had 7 or 8, 9, 10 years of experience doing that very thing for larger corporate events, and had brought in the designers and the project managers that we needed to do that kind of thing. And I think that was a time of transition and growth for a lot of companies that were in that position, where they wanted to be the everything for everybody kind of thing. And forgive me if I'm wandering around too much, because my brain is sort of firing in a bunch of different cylinders right now, thinking about this and just sort of reflecting on that time. It was a challenging period for recognizing who you really needed to go to be that kind of technical producer that we now have so many of, versus your AV company that could rent you gear. And yeah, so I mean, just to go back and actually answer your question, yes, absolutely. I've been in a time and a place in my life where, both where I was being asked to help design a thing that I had to say no to because I just didn't have the expertise, and the company I was with didn't have the expertise to do that. It really wasn't our purview. And then later on, being in a place where we were sort of being treated as a rental company. It really wasn't what we did anymore, and it wasn't what we wanted to do. We wanted to take on more and help more. And being a rental company was great for revenue, because the margins on renting equipment is fantastic. But it wasn't the interesting work that we wanted to do, and I think that was
So we've seen that trend, as you said, 10, 15 years ago, where and I think that trend came from a lack of those technical producers being out there, right? Especially in a market like Toronto. I think in larger U.S. markets where there's less of a saturation, or a saturation on one side, but there was a lack on of, say, technical producers and technical production designers in that market. That sort of drove that idea of, well, because when I was working for AV companies back then, yeah, we were an AV rental company. We wanted to get our gear off the shelf for that high margin rental. But at the same time, we had clients coming to us and saying, nobody can do this within my team, and nobody is out there that can do this. So can you do that? And so it became a value add that that I know a lot of leadership at these companies would say, well, it's not really what we do. It's a value add. We don't necessarily understand the value and the price point, for instance, that we should be charging for this. They looked to other models in different markets and saw, and it's a little bit of a Canadianism that they were like, "Ooh, that feels like too much. I don't want to charge them that much for a Timmy's," kind of thing, and sort of and muddy that market. And so what's interesting that you said that sort of declined 2018, 2019, until we got into the pandemic, at which point the consequence that came out of the pandemic, and I think you and I have talked about this, offline before, is this more hyper specialization, right? That a lot of AV companies came out of the pandemic having tried to do things that were outside of what they were built to do, whether that was through virtual or technical design consultation or whatever it might be. But as soon as the pandemic ended and everything went back, what I've heard from a lot of AV companies and rental companies is, I want to get back to what we are, which is an AV rental company. I want to stay in my market where, like, I can deliver things within a 1 hour drive with my truck and not try and be some out of market selling the value of our creativity and our design and project management, right? Although great things that we can partner with, a lot of AV companies are now sort of saying, no, we have an office in Vegas, and we're gonna work in Vegas, and that's where we work, right? And I've heard a lot more outreach, being a production company, from those AV companies who are now not like tucking their tails or anything, but they're certainly coming back and saying, okay, well, we had this strategy where we wanted to be all things to all people, but that after the pandemic, we realized that was not a great strategy for us anymore. So now they're reeling back. And what I'm seeing is a tendency from agency or planning organizations that would normally go to AV company A and say, hey, can I have your production designer do this? And now those AV companies are saying, we actually don't do that. What you need to do is find a production company, and then we'll work with them, which I think is an interesting trend in antithesis to what you were saying about 15 years ago.
It's funny that you say that, because I've actually sort of found, I don't want to say the exact opposite, but I found sort of a different thing happens as well. But there are companies that sort of are clinging tooth and nail to that extra scope that they picked up over the pandemic. And we see this in some of the AV companies that built studios, that changed their physical premises so that they could survive, and sort of really bought into it. And as a result, they want to, or they are still currently trying to pick up some of the extra production management, the extra producer roles that they took on. So one of the interesting things that happened during the pandemic that changed this, and I think that some of this, not to hop around too much, but some of this change actually started in 2017, 2018. And I'll loop back to that when it's more relevant. But when we started charging for the extra responsibilities, the drawings and the project management, when AV companies started to do that. But I see them taking on more scope and wanting to hold on to that tooth and nail, and and this is going to sound horrible, but it actually is something that I have a personal challenge with. cut out some of their direct clients to get to their clients and take on some of the role that their producers and planners would do. And I've seen this happening. I have seen this happen at some of the companies I've worked with, where maybe it's a survival technique, maybe it's a strategy, but an AV company will talk to the end client and say, "Listen, we can save you money by taking on some of this scope. You can handle this internally, and we can do the rest of it, and you don't need this other person." And then the producer gets sort of cut out of the loop, and the AV company works directly with the end client, and they trundle off happily ever after. And then the producer sort of gets left in the cold. And I feel like some of the expertise that the producer would bring is lost, because at the end of the day, the AV company that is playing the role of technical producer or producer, they are more motivated to, as we sort of touched on earlier, sell the gear that they own.
And I think that's one of the issues that has always arisen when the AV rental company tries to be the technical production or the production company. And further to your point, where you're saying that now there are certain companies out there, and they shall remain the obvious, have started to take on those producer positions, and the advantages or disadvantages to the end client aside, I do think that sort of limits choices, and I'll put it in the context of, one big AV company that I was once being recruited to, and they were like, "Look, we want to be a big production company," and I said, "That's fantastic." So. And I said, is that a separate arm from your audiovisual rental business? Is it a sort of separate entity? And they went, "No, it's all like we're all one big, global family." And I said, "Well, that's really great. So does that mean that you would like me to go out and sell a contract where you have no gear on the show and that we're just producing the show? And that is the total revenue budget for that." And they both of them, like the VP and the GM that I was sitting and having dinner with, sort of ruffled their feathers for a second and said, "Well, no, that's not why we're doing this." And I said, "Okay, then you're not a production company, right? You're an AV rental company that is trying to tack on production services as either a new revenue stream or as a loss leader into trying to get more rentals out the door." And they nodded and said, "Oh, well, I suppose that's true." And I said, "Well, that's great. Well, how I sell that is different than how I would offer that solution to somebody else." And so let's just sort of talk about, like, what do you think are the advantages to an AV or a meeting planner or an organizer or producer between an AV company, a production company? And I'll start that off with, I kind of think that AV companies are really designed to work with production companies. I brought it up in a talk recently about, understanding what type of buyer you are. Like, are you a technical buyer or are you a scope buyer? Right. And so a technical buyer to me is me, or potentially you, that when I'm looking at a quote from an AV rental company, what I'm looking for is specific product codes and instrumentation, and what LED tile is that, and is that an Absen versus a Unilumen? And because I'm a very technical buyer, whereas most event planners, producers, or agencies are scope buying. They are, and the classic thing that we always lament about in this business. I spent like 6 days writing a gigantic proposal. They opened it to the last page and went down to the bottom line and said, "How much is it really going to cost me? And does it include what I want?" Right. And so, what do you think is the advantage of using, like, if you're a meeting and event planner or an organizer, what's the advantage of using an AV company versus a production company?
Personally, I think the advantage of working with an AV company is similar to what you said. You can get item A, item B, item C, and the only thing you need to consider, because everyone who's got item B, you're going to look for quality and you're going to look for price. But you need to know what you're looking at. I think if you're talking, and that's someone who can help you with anything where you just need a breakout room, you need a stage, you need stuff, and you can tell them what you want, and maybe they'll advise you a bit on what bits of gear would be work best in this room or whatever. But you are designing your show, and you are in charge of your show. And so a lot of internal event planners can manage. If we're talking to about a Deloitte or a Scotiabank or a CIBC, they've got internal event planners who manage events, and this is what they do. And then they can just go to an AV company and say, I need to put 500 people in this room. I need a stage and a backdrop, and I need an audio rig, and it needs to go in on Thursday and needs to come out on Sunday. And in between, we're going to have these shows. I think the advantage of working with a production company is that you don't have that expertise. You know that you need to deliver something for your client, and you know how many people are going to show up, and you may or may not know your venue. So you go to a production company to help you design this thing. And that's sort of where the difference is. It's the sort of the brain work as opposed to the brawn of the thing. As a guy who started as a technician, I recognize feels and sounds a little insulting, but that's what we did. I mean, when I started out in this industry, I delivered lighting packages, and I thought I was, I had all the arrogance of a kid at 25, showing up with my truck and all the gear and all the rigging. I'm a rigger. I'm a lighting designer. I was putting up 24 par cans in a conference room, and and helping lay out laptop power. That's sort of a producer, a production company will help you actually achieve goals as opposed to set up your show for you. And if there's a soundbite, that might be it.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Yeah, I see it the exact same way. As I said, that we're as a production company, we are the technical buyer. So, when we are requesting things, it isn't just, can I have a moving light? It's, can I have this specific Chauvet professional model number, and I need this many quantities and this many bits of cable. So, I know that what I'm saying is actually sort of limiting the market for AV rental companies, but the reality is that's not actually true, because there's quite a lot. And so, but to me, the advantage of a production company is about framing messaging in an appropriate way. And so it goes to the debate that we have. Well, not the debate, the question that I ask new employees whenever I bring them on. And I'm asking a very specific question, which is, what does a projector do on site? Right. And the technical people will say, oh, it's, they'll start going into like it's a 3-chip DLP projector, and it's got this kind of light source and this much power. And I'm like, okay, you deserve to be in an AV company. That's where you need to go, right? Because you're a gearhead and you need to understand, and that's your advantage. Whereas when the answer that I'm looking for, paraphrased, is, it frames content really well, right? And so that's, I think, the difference, that a production company thinks of the same venue, the same setup, and an AV company thinks of that setup in two different ways. The production company thinks about it as, how does all of this technology, bits of stage, LED tile, lighting instruments, PA, whatever it might be, how does that frame my client's message, design intent, and how can we be a good steward of the budget? Versus an AV company, which is, I put this stuff on an order and I delivered it, right? One is, the advantage is thought process, design, intent. The other one is fulfillment. Both very, very critical parts of that production. But understanding those two key points, I think, is really important for understanding what type of partner you should be working with.
You sort of, and I know you weren't, I mean, you were touching on this and you didn't get into it, but I think that is, you said when company X was trying to recruit you, and they said they wanted to move to being a production company, and your question was, would you be okay with me writing a contract that had no equipment on it? I think that is actually probably a great distinction for a planner to look at. Is like, if you're going to hire a production company, then consider them as maybe not owning gear. They don't bring gear with them. They help you find gear maybe, but you're not looking to rent gear from them. And that sort of, I think, maybe frees up some of the distinction, because I think there are a lot of production companies out there in the world, he said with air quotes, that are, let's say, AV companies plus. They offer a few more services, but really what they are there to do is to sell you their equipment. Without getting into too many details, I've worked for a couple of different companies that approach this from different ways. I've worked for one company that if we didn't own the stuff, we could give a flying fig. We would go out and find you what you needed for your event, and help you, whether that was cross rentals, whether that was buying it or building it or whatever. If you needed a thing in order to achieve whatever your goal was, we would make sure that thing showed up. I've worked for another company that if you needed a thing that we didn't own, we would convince you to use the thing that we had, or the thing that we had a partnership to get. And that second method never felt great to me. I recognize that the one company that I'm talking about that would go and find the thing wasn't really what we're talking about when we're talking about production companies, and it was what they wanted to be. And that was the philosophy we came from, was that whether we own the gear or not, we're going to try to do our best for you. And it's in my brain, I always sort of connected that with the concept of partnership as opposed to being a vendor. And I think that might be another thing that ties into this, is that a producer, a production company, is a partner in your event, in that they will help you devise strategy, and they'll take the same risks that you do in making the thing go. Whereas an AV supplier, a vendor, is someone who mitigates risk by saying, this is what we've got, and you should buy that, kind of thing.
Yeah, and I think my point that I was trying to make about post-pandemic, that sort of shift in the market, is that AV companies have started to go to that secondary model more and more, right? Where if it's not in our inventory and we don't do it, or we don't have maybe a strategic partner or whatever it might be, they say no right now. And so that, I think, has left the market a little bit lacking. Like, a lot of customers are now like caught on the back foot with that, right? Because they used to go to that first type that would say, wherever it is, we'll figure it out for you. And now they're saying no. They're saying, well, sorry, we never owned that particular, like, TV, whatever it might be. So we don't own that. So we're not going to, we're just going to say, well, we'll do everything else, but we're not doing that part. Right. And now planners are, it's driving inflation a little bit to try and stress levels to try and go, okay, well, and I'll use the example here in Toronto. There's a large LED sub-supplier, right, that pretty much everybody uses for LED tile. There are a few companies that have invested in LED tile, but nowhere near the inventory that's required for the volume of their shows. So they all go to this company, right? We do as well when we're sourcing. But that where, pre-pandemic, they would have said, they would have beaten up that company and tried to get a better margin and then mark it up and then say, that's coming from us, quote unquote, right? They're now saying, well, we don't have that inventory, but go to these guys. And now that's adding that extra stressor to those agency and planner teams. And so that's where I think, when we talk about when a production company should be used versus just going straight to an AV rental company, it's in those situations when it's large enough that you need that kind of specialized inventory, that you need a production company to manage multiple vendors now. And so I think that's there. And to your point where you were just saying about, the not having any inventory, maybe that's the way that production companies should operate. That's certainly our model. We don't own inventory. It's part of our sustainability strategy, because we think transporting 353-foot trailers worth of gear from Toronto to Las Vegas makes absolutely no sense when there's enough of that gear in that market to be able to source locally. We do have a little bit of inventory for consoles and computers and media servers and all that kind of stuff, which we think are mission critical. But other than that, I think you're right about that a production company, spends all of its time and energy on drawings and planning and crew schedules and production schedules, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Whereas an AV company wants to know exactly what's on your order and how am I going to fulfill that? And that's, to me, that's the main.
Well, I think for the larger, more sophisticated shows, I think that is one of the best models to adopt. Going with an all-in-one provider is fantastic for your middling, I'd say middling shows, but like for your events, it's like a couple of rooms at the convention center. It's but I think I've had the pleasure of working with our friend Mr. Cosgrave at JST Productions, and this is the model that he uses for specifically for Super Gala. I can't speak to all of the work he does because I've only worked with him on a few shows, but Super Gala he does excellently well, and that's what he does is that he manages the overall production, and he hires Christie Lights to do the lighting, and he hires a drapery company to do the draping, and he hires a staging company to do the staging. And I think that's brilliant because a good producer can either a good producer can employ the best experts in any discipline that you require without being hung up on who in my company is available that day. Because I think we've both been in the position where we've worked for all-in-one providers, and you sometimes you get the A team on your shows, and sometimes you get a great lighting designer, and you get whoever was available to set up to design or build the stage or whatever. If you can work with a producer who can reach out to people who aren't, or reach out to experts in any individual field, then you get the best of everything, and you're not married to a company that excels at lighting but kind of does staging on the side, or is excellent at audio and also owns some projector kind of thing. And I think that's brilliant particularly for the larger, more complicated gigs. Because then you don't have people who are trying to again, go back to designing to what they own, or trying to change your vision to what they can realistically accomplish well.
Yeah, for sure.
You can go and find the people who
Yeah,
can
and look, I think that there's an appropriate time for, as you said, an AV rental company that maybe offers a little bit of production services as a value add. I think there are appropriate times for that within the market, right? And I think you and I sort of mentioned earlier, they tend to be on the smaller, less complex, and less sophisticated scale. Which isn't to say that they don't bring amazing value and aplomb and expertise to those situations. But when it's all in-house inventory at that AV rental company, and it's really about like there isn't really a story to tell. It's a breakout session at a hotel downtown. For 100 people, you need 2 projection screens, a podium, and a mic that works, kind of thing. I do think that those are the appropriate places for those AV rental companies to contract that service offering scale and scope into that single bubble. However, that the moment that you start to go above that, I think it's in the best interest of the AV rental company to say, hey, this has gotten to a point, right, where this is more complex than we can churn out through fulfillment. So this is where I recommend that you should go to a production company, and we're happy to work with whoever you end up working with. I think production companies can be a little bit territorial, and I think that AV companies can be a little bit territorial in that scope, right? That certainly if we have this gigantic automotive client that's going to do a breakout room in Wichita, Kansas. I don't even know if that's really a place, so don't judge me. Do I want to be involved? It's pretty small scale, and it doesn't really take a lot of drawing, pre-planning, or production design. It's really facilitation and fulfillment. I don't want to be precious about facilitating that for the client in risk of losing it to some AV company who swoops in and says, we can do all these things too. I just don't think that that's happening anymore. And so in the same vein, I think AV companies need to go, hey, you know what, we've hit our limit, right? Like we can do your 1,000-person thing at the Delta with these 12-foot ceilings because it's all our inventory. You don't need a high design factor. But the moment it becomes a sophisticated execution, then I feel like they should be turning around and going, okay, mea culpa, this is not us, but here's somebody that you can bring in, and here's what they're going to charge for their services and their bits and pieces, and we'll still have that relationship with that client and be able to help service them. But I think you said it when talking about a production company, like, let's get the best experts into this, right? And that has to come from both sides of that Venn diagram.
Agreed. Yeah. Just a great way of doing business and being a good player in our community is to serve your clients well by recognizing when something isn't part of your purview and then making the connection to someone who can do that thing that you can't do well or that you don't do well. And then there's a sort of a reciprocal kind of relationship there as well, because then everyone trusts everyone else, and your client recognizes that you've been vulnerable with them, and you've been willing to be vulnerable and say, this is a thing that I can't do. And you've made a valuable connection between them and someone who can do it. And you've also provided value to that other person, that third party, to help with, you've made that connection. And that's always something that I've loved to do, is to, and I've done that a few times. I've been allowed to do that a few times over the course of the last 5-6 years, where I was working with a client and say, you really need to talk to a planner. And here's a planner I know who does this really well, whether it's fundraising or a corporate thing. There are different people have different strengths, and make that connection. And then you sort of get all of those relationships together. And I think everything gets stronger. I think one of the challenges that happens is that some of these AV companies that want to become production companies feel like they're putting themselves at risk by giving up that scope, and don't want to be that vulnerable with their clients. They don't want to, put themselves in a position where they're potentially putting a chunk of their relationship at risk by saying, I don't know how to do that well, which is unfortunate.
I think the reverse is also true of production companies who are potentially a little nervous about sort of almost revealing their sub-suppliers, right? Like, I got a call from a producer the other day who was asking about some resources that might be available in Las Vegas. And the first part of that conversation was admittedly a little bit of a sales pitch. I was like, that's what we do for people like you, right? So we'll help you with that. And he thought that was really interesting. But he was like, barring that, who do you use? And I was very transparent. And admittedly, most of our suppliers in those markets are what I would call wholesale AV suppliers, right? They have mission statements on their website saying, we don't want to deal with agencies or planners. We where's the production company is essentially what they say. And so, certainly protection is a little bit about that relationship, but many a day I get a call asking for, something that would be not necessarily in our scope or where we feel we could add value to that equation, and say, here's Jim, and Jim is at this office and he's right down the road from your venue. Please go and talk to Jim. And I found it was scary at first when we started doing that, admittedly, as a business owner. I was like, oh my God, why am I giving up this potential $5 of revenue? Then it comes back to you a millionfold, right? That they're like, thanks for having our back. That's I think what clients and customers want, no matter what, is somebody to just have my back, right? And I think that's the role of a production company. I think that's all right. So we're just about a little bit out of time for this episode. Do you have any final thoughts that you want to share with everybody about AV company versus AV rental company versus production company?
I think the best way to describe it is, and if you're looking for equipment, you go to an AV company. If you're looking for a partner in your production, someone to help you produce your event, you go to a production company. And I think the way to tell the two of them together is if one of them is going to sell you their gear, or if one of them is going to help you design your event. I think that's the key takeaways.
I think that was the perfect way to put it. I cannot top that, so I will not try. Thanks very much, Michael, and we'll see you on the next guide episode.
Thank you very much for having me. I've really appreciated it.
Production Value Matters, the business event podcast, is brought to you by Byrne Production Services. To find out more about Byrne Production Services and how putting on events can drive value for your business, visit byrneproductionservices.com. Make sure to click subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. And on behalf of the team here at Production Value Matters, thank you so much for listening.